The inauguration of the President of the United States, conducted once every 4 years, is a tradition unlike no other. Today's guest, author, presidential historian, and UVA professor of governance Barbara Perry, talks about this tradition, how it's evolved, why it still matters, and shares some of its most interesting storylines. From blizzards and blown lines to parties and parades. Today, from Ballard Studios in Tampa, Florida, it's 13th and Park.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
That often is missing in politics.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
It's a nightmare.
Those are the facts.
We have to solve everything.
What's in this tea?
Well, it's great to have you on the show today. We understand by your background and what you've done, not just the books you've written and the things you've commented on television, but your work in terms of presidential history, that you are the perfect person to talk to try to get a bead on an incredible American tradition called the inauguration. So here we go. Obviously, President Trump is coming for the second time for a presidential inauguration to raise his hand and to swear to do what's best for the good of the country. Why are inaugurations so historically and symbolically important?
I think it's our version of coronations. Obviously, we don't have royalty, although we sometimes treat some of our political families and dynasties like royalty. And we may have a dynasty in the making right now with the Trumps. But certainly the Adamses and the Roosevelts and the Kennedys, we seem to want that kind of element of royalty. We miss that pomp and circumstance. But obviously, we fought a revolution to get away from a king and a monarch. So I think this is our substitute for that. And so be it. It should be that way. And noting what a lot of people were saying last week about Jimmy Carter, that when he thought he should pare down the so-called imperial presidency that had developed with the powers of the presidency and some of the pomp and circumstance he thought was too much. And he was the populist, the man from Plains. And it turned out people missed seeing Hail to the Chief. And they didn't really want to see the president in a cardigan. They wanted to see him in a coat and tie in the White House. Mm-hmm. So I think it's part and parcel. It goes all the way back to George Washington and 1789. And there was a celebration surrounding his inaugural. So we've been doing this ever since we've had a president.
I can say for those listeners who weren't alive for the Carter inauguration, that when he decided to walk at the front of that parade after the inauguration swearing in down Pennsylvania Avenue, that was breaking with a lot of tradition. In fact, I think you had to go back to the days of practically Thomas Jefferson, I think, when that last happened. That was very much keeping with his kind of self-image, his brand, as you say, man of the people. But this one, it's interesting to note, Barbara, that this inauguration will happen on MLK Jr. Day, of all things, a tradition in January that shifted because of the 20th Amendment, which moved the date of the inauguration from March 4th to January 20th, unless it was held on a Sunday. How significant was that 20th Amendment change, given it tightened the gap between the actual election and the beginning of a new government?
Well, first of all, let me say I was there and witnessed Jimmy Carter getting out of the limousine with Rosalynn, the new first lady. And I had run around from the other side of the Capitol because up until that time, these inaugurations were held on the east side of the Capitol at that portico. And it was Ronald Reagan in 1981 who switched over to the much more expansive view of the Mall and the Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial. So in some ways, then how appropriate that it would this year fall on Martin Luther King Day, when you think of that one end of the monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and the fact that it was there that Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963. But in terms of why change from March to January, we should note that that 20th Amendment becomes active and is ratified in 1937. So it's the second inaugural of FDR. What had happened in the first inaugural, where you had to wait from November of 1932 all the way to March of 1933 to have an inauguration and get the president in the White House and get him in power? The Great Depression, 25% of the people out of work, people riding the rails, people living in cardboard boxes. Anybody who knows anything about the Great Depression knows what a difficult time that was for our country. And it was a worldwide depression and a climate disaster in the Midwest with the Dust Bowl. So we needed to have a president in power earlier, and we needed to get the lame duck president out sooner. And that was the reason for the change and the constitutional amendment in 1937.
Well, these are all live theater, these things called inaugurations. And you go back in history as you have, and you look at some of the most unexpected moments, right? When William Henry Harrison gave an 8,000 word inaugural speech in bitter cold to his ultimate demise because he passed away, I think it was 33 days later from pneumonia. You've got the partying of the public who came storming into the White House under Andrew Jackson. You've got Dwight Eisenhower, who was on the review stand at the parade and was lassoed by Monty Montana. I think that was the name of the cowboy, completely out of the blue. Closer to now, you had Justice Roberts, astute and learned, who couldn't remember the oath of office to deliver and have repeated by Barack Obama. Of all those kinds of moments, what were your favorites? What were the biggest takeaways? The ones that said, you know what, despite all the best laid plans, we're all human.
We are indeed, even presidents. So the first lesson is cut short, be brief in your inaugural address, especially if it's bitterly cold or raining. And so some of those march, as in the William Henry Harrison inauguration. There have been some more medical interpretations of the William Henry Harrison demise. Some people think now it was typhus because the sanitary conditions in the White House were so bad. But I'm sure his speaking in the cold rain for a couple of hours was not the way to go. So either by pneumonia or typhus, he was gone within just about a month. The worst of the bloopers, as I call them, we could run a video on inaugural bloopers. And it has to be Chief Justice Roberts stumbling over the oath.
Are you prepared to take the oath, Senator?
I am.
But Chief Justice John Roberts wasn't all that prepared to administer it on Tuesday.
That I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully.
That I will execute
faithfully the office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States faithfully.
Later, Roberts told the president, "My bad."
The reason they repeated it at the White House the next day was that there was some fear that there could be a challenge to whether Barack Obama was the official president, since the words that are in the Constitution of the oath had been stumbled over. And yes, Chief Justice Roberts is brilliant. He's viewed as the most brilliant legal mind of his generation. I would say my generation of the baby boomers. The other issue, though, is I think he's a little vain and he didn't want to wear his reading glasses in order to read it out. And given his steel-trapped legal mind, I'm sure he thought, oh, I've memorized this. This won't be a problem. But again, human nature comes into play and he stumbled over the words. And so Barack Obama had to be sworn in a second time. My other favorite story is that Cardinal Cushing, who was the bishop, the prelate, the cardinal of the Kennedys, he married Jacqueline and John Kennedy in 1953, and he gave an invocation in 1961 at the Kennedy inaugural. And as he was speaking, the podium started to smoke. There was actually smoke coming from it. And it wasn't because he was doing hellfire and brimstone. They didn't know what was happening. But if you look at the picture, you can see both President Kennedy, soon to be president, and the outgoing president, Dwight Eisenhower, looking like they're praying, but looking over to say, oh, what's happening? And later on, it turned out it was an electrical short in the podium. But Cardinal Cushing said, I didn't know what it was. And I thought at any moment, this podium might explode and I might be catapulted across the Capitol to the other side.
Well, it goes back to my original point of it's live theater, right? So there's no act two or take two. I mean, you're rolling through whatever is about to happen, planned or not.
Exactly.
So, Barbara, inaugurations, if you go back in history, have been held in different places, right? Not just around the Capitol, from the East Front now to the West Front, but from Federal Hall. Has that had any kind of impact on crowd size, on, you might say, the television capture of this in more recent times?
I think it does. And I think it was a stroke of genius for Ronald Reagan to move to the west side of the Capitol, down the mall, again, towards those beautiful monuments that are so iconic. And it does allow for more people to crowd in. I can tell you from 1977, having been at that last inaugural held on the east side of the Capitol, we were packed in like sardines because you only have from the portico and they have to get all of the important people close by and they have to get the TV cameras in. So you only really have up to the first street that runs between the Supreme Court building and the Capitol. Now, the good news was we were packed in like sardines because it was really cold. It was so cold that day, the Potomac River was frozen over. And then you hope, if you're the incoming president, that you have an Obama situation where you have people all the way back to the Washington Monument,
Right.
just packed in. And then, of course, there was some controversy over the first Trump inaugural about whether there were more people than ever. And image is everything, as we know in politics. And so if you're the incoming president, you want to make sure that you have as many people as possible in the venue.
Well, apparently the Trump inaugural ticket is the hottest ticket of the decade. So I don't think crowd size is going to be the issue this time.
As well as for the balls, for the inaugural balls. They're sold out on the highest level tickets.
Well, let's talk about that. The balls, the parades, the religious ceremonies, all these are kind of packaged into a couple day period. How important is that and kind of signaling to the country and to the world what this new president, or in this case, a repeating president, intends to do?
First of all, you want to have a sense of unity of your party. And so having all of these balls, there have been as many as 20 plus balls over the years for some presidents. And those are not only the national level balls that are run by the committees, the national committees of the two parties, but also states can have their own balls. So you want to really take care of your people, the people who voted for you, the donors, solidify the party, make people feel good as they leave Washington to go back to their homes and work towards the midterms. So the midterm elections for Congress will be here before we know it. And then obviously another election 2028. So that's really important. The religious services that you mentioned, we have this constitutional wall of separation between church and state, or at least the way Thomas Jefferson interpreted the First Amendment and the way the court has interpreted the First Amendment. But we know that religion has always been an important part of our politics. And indeed, George Washington and members of Congress in New York, where our capital was in 1789, attended a religious service together to launch off on the right religious foot, if you will. And I would say, finally, the parades are part of that. I will use that term coronation process, that really those began with Thomas Jefferson. The first time we had an inaugural in our new capital of Washington, D.C. in 1801, a number of people from the Navy Yard decided to march along with him. He was on horseback coming down Pennsylvania Avenue. And then by the time you mentioned William Henry Harrison and his abrupt departure not long after his inaugural, right. But in 1841, that was the first time that they really had bands and what they called marching societies had gathered from around the country to accompany the president. And then following the Jimmy Carter tradition, they no longer, for security reasons, walk the entire length of Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol all the way to the White House. But now it's the tradition to get out of the limousine and walk part of that way. So it's the first time we see a new president, or we see the second time a president's been inaugurated with his spouse and oftentimes with other members of the family. So it's an uplifting, I think, process to see all of these different elements around the actual swearing in. If it was only the oath of office, it would be a very short inaugural ceremony.
Well, what isn't short normally is the inaugural address. And that's the one thing that is most focused on. You go back in history, again, as you have so often, Barbara, I think about Thomas Jefferson when he was trying to show that difference of opinion doesn't mean a difference in common purpose. The only thing to fear is fear itself, FDR. John F. Kennedy asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. 1,000 Points of Light from George Herbert Walker Bush. All these kind of memorable moments. How important is the inaugural speech in kind of letting the country know this is what I intend to do and how I intend to do it?
What's interesting to me, Adam, about the speeches is that you named off the lines that are famous, right, including Lincoln's second, with malice toward none, charity toward all, as he saw the end of the Civil War coming towards him. Sadly, he would die of assassination at about that time, just a month later. But it is an opportunity, much as you said with Thomas Jefferson, to say at the first time we had really two parties going at each other, hammer and tongs, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, his party. And he said, we're all Federalists. We're all Republicans. Yeah. In other words, we're all for the same thing. We're all for our country. And all presidents should want that. And we should want that from all presidents. So that's the good news, I think, about inaugural addresses. They can bring us together. They can be memorable. They can be great oratory if they are well written and well delivered. Unfortunately, the ones that you and I have just named are about the only memorable ones. Isn't that an interesting irony?
Yeah.
That it is such an important part of the ceremony, and yet most people a week after it's over couldn't tell you a line, couldn't repeat a line. And I think it's because there are really so few great speech writers and so few Lincolns. Lincoln was his own speech writer, and he was brilliant at it. And the Peggy Noonans of Ronald Reagan, the Ted Sorensens, they're considered great because they're unusual. And we should also face it that the way presidents get elected, as Mario Cuomo used to say, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. And we would hope there'd be a certain poetic life to these inaugural addresses, but I fear that they end up being more quotidian, more sort of prosaic rather than being something that we will remember forever. So I think the best thing for a president to do is make that unification argument and then say what he intends to do. And if he can do that in a way that's both beautifully written as well as expertly delivered, he'll be that much farther down the road coming into the White House.
Well, you have a president coming into office who has pledged himself and his administration to dramatic change, I think it's fair to say. Doesn't that mean that this particular inaugural speech maybe is even more significant than his first one, where he's coming in as the outsider and trying to kind of get his bearings in Washington? This time, he's made it very clear what he wants to do, who's going to be with him in making that happen. And yet it's talking about massive change, which even though the American public in poll after poll is kind of screaming for, we also as human beings are a little bit nervous about how change can play out.
Yes, I think that this in some ways is equivalent to the time of Lincoln coming in 1861. Thank goodness, not nearly as a crisis situation. We don't have the Union breaking apart and devolving into civil war. Maybe a bit more like the Great Depression of 1933, where in both instances, those presidents and now this incoming president are wanting and needing to make change and saying that they're going to have to make change. Certainly FDR in 33 to address the problems the country faces. So I think President Trump will want to do the same.
Are you bullish about the presidency itself in terms of its image, its prestige? We know about its impact moving forward, not just for President Trump, but for presidents to come. And what do we need to do as Americans to reinforce that?
I have to tell you, I am not only a scholar of the presidency, but also the Constitution and the Supreme Court particularly, and have served in those branches of government, sometimes at low levels of intern. But I am a patriot. My dad's a World War II veteran, my brother, Vietnam veteran. So I am a huge embracer of our country, of our Constitution, our system, and our institutions. And so there's no doubt that the presidency as an office has taken hits over the years, usually from the behavior of presidents in that office. Let's say Nixon and Watergate, Bill Clinton and his issues related to womanizing. We know that this incoming president is one who likes to break China. Let's hope it's not White House China, but likes to stir things up and stir the pot. And that's how he was elected the first time and probably the second time.
Where do you plan, by the way, to be on Inauguration Day?
Here in my lovely home in Charlottesville, the home of Thomas Jefferson, and being grateful to be at the university that he founded. And by the way, Bill Clinton started his inaugural journey here. And it is sometimes interesting to see how presidents want to come into town. And Bill Clinton decided he would follow Thomas Jefferson's footsteps, except not go by horseback. He went by a giant Greyhound bus. So I'll be here thinking of Jefferson and moving forward with the second non-consecutive president we have had after Grover Cleveland.
Well, fortunately, inaugurations are now some of the best made-for-television events ever. So you're not going to miss anything. You'll miss the cold, but not
I will miss the
else.
cold, but I won't be sorry for that.
Well, thank you so much for your perspective. Thank you so much for basically teaching America why we are where we are, with an incredible tradition and history behind us, and a lot of reason to feel optimistic about what's ahead.
Well, Adam, thank you. And thank you for the good work you're doing with 13th and Park and allowing space for these kinds of conversations where we can be what Thomas Jefferson hoped we would be, and that is able to talk to each other, no matter what personal politics we might have, but talk in a civic engagement. And so thank you for that, and look forward to being with you again.
Same here. Take care of yourself.